Good afternoon and welcome to the Irish Times Cybersecurity Focus in partnership with Huawei and EdgeScan. I'm Ciara O'Brien and business and technology journalist with the Irish Times. And today we'll be discussing all things cybersecurity, everything from ransomware and managing risks, the emerging trends in the threat landscape. And it's definitely a topical subject. Recent cybersecurity surveys have painted a worrying picture for Irish businesses. While attacks are rising and have done for some time, businesses are still underinvesting in their defenses. Joining me today are two experts in the field, Huawei's Andy Purdy and EdgeScan's Owen Keary. Just to give a brief introduction to our guests, Andy has a distinguished career in cybersecurity. He's currently the Chief Security Officer for Huawei Technologies USA. He focuses on cybersecurity and user privacy protection program, and he is also a participant in the Software and Supply Chain Assurance Forum in the US. Among his many achievements, he also helped draft the US National Strategy to Secure Cyberspace in 2003, helped form and launch the National Cybersecurity Division, and the US Computer Emergency Readiness Team, that's the US CSERT. Owen Keary is Chief Executive of EdgeScan, a managed web vulnerability and threat detection service, and is a well-known technical leader in the industry in the area of software security and penetration testing. He's led global security engagements for some of the world's largest financial services and consumer products companies. He was previously an international board member of the Open Web Application Security Project, founding the Security Code Review Guide, and also contributed to the OWASP SAMM. So I think we can agree they are both well qualified to talk about the current cybersecurity landscape. To dive right into things, I'll start with my panelists. What are the chief threats facing companies, and what do you think will be the key challenge in the coming year or two?
Andy, you want to go first?
I think we've got a number of continuing threats. I think individuals and organizations, often because of a lack of what they call cyber hygiene, can be vulnerable to general attacks that plague cyberspace, but also targeted attacks. And a number of reasons for this. Sometimes it varies depending on what is the nature of the business and how significant is the potential target. But the possibility of infiltrating a company or an individual or the family for financial gain, to steal or use their credentials to commit financial fraud, and to be used to launch attacks on other people using their credentials. Those are just a couple things. I'm sure Jan has a few more.
Yeah, I think, a no-brainer, an obvious one is ransomware as a threat. Ransomware and hacking are sort of the idea of hacking into a system are cousins. A lot of ransomware attacks start with a manual breach, and then a lot of pivoting once an organization is breached. It can be manual as well. There's something else which is somewhat overlooked. Maybe, I'm not sure. It has gained some traction, but it's IoT security. So as lately as about 4 days ago, Akamai had to stop a 17.2 million requests per second DDoS attack. And that was by the attackers leveraged, for example, lots of insecure IoT being your fridge, your doorbell, your CCTV system. Lots of these systems are insecure, and they're leveraging those and turning them into sort of slaves or zombies in order to control them for massive attacks. So something like IoT security, it would be a pretty important one. I think ultimately it comes down to fundamentals. It comes down to lots and lots of these problems, apart from the social aspect, is in relation to sort of software security. I think a lot of paths lead to the idea of achieving secure software.
Just to come back to that IoT point that you made there, Owen, I mean, if we're talking about all this Internet of Things, like everything seems to have an internet connection in it these days. I'm looking around my house. My dishwasher has a Wi-Fi connection. So is this going to be a massive problem facing businesses? Because not only are they facing this from outside their own business, but they probably have quite a lot of devices that would qualify as IoT, and there is a push towards IoT in in the manufacturing industry as well. I mean, how do we cope with this kind of a threat?
It's a hard one, and I'm sure Andy will have some good insights, given that Huawei do a lot of consumer products. But you know, in my opinion, IoT, a lot of it is low power. It doesn't have they're not particularly powerful pieces of hardware to connect, and therefore they're designed pretty much with sort of being cost effective. Security is an afterthought. I'm sure when you bought your dishwasher, you didn't ask, did it have a security controls and a security protocol to protect your dishwasher from being hacked, right? So if the buyer and the seller pretty much don't care, well, why would anybody else care? So it's going to be, and it is a large problem. And currently it's easily used for things like distributed denial of service attacks. But you know, weak IoT systems, if it's connected to your Wi-Fi, you know, hackers may be able to pivot, you know, across your Wi-Fi into other systems. But it's not just domestic IoT. It can be control systems for water purification. It can be energy. It can be things which could in effect cause civil unrest. So it's something that we need to catch up on. We're all mad to put things on the internet. In some cases, I'm not sure why. I would never buy a fridge that connects to the internet. I don't see the value in it. Some people obviously do. But you know, the industry needs to catch up because anything with a microchip and that processes data, in effect, is a potential target.
And
the Internet Society has some good recommendations. They incorporated the work of the Online Threat Alliance a few years ago. Some good guidelines, and I think it's important as part of collaboration generally between public and private sector that we'll talk about later, to try to focus on what are some of these best practices. And we might even get to the point where major outlets will agree to have certain kinds of best practices that they will require of the products that they sell, and larger organizations of the products that they use. So those kinds of things, short of some kind of prescriptive regulation, I think can go a long way toward helping us reduce the risk.
I totally agree with that. Yep.
There is, I suppose, for a lot of companies now, this last 18 months has been a massive push to digitizing the workplace, giving their employees access to systems from home. Maybe this is something that they didn't do before. It's changed the way we work. It's changed how we possibly will work in the future, because the surveys that we're seeing indicate that not everybody wants to go back to the office. Yep. 5 days a week, 9 to 5, once all this kind of settles, and that there is going to be a hybrid way of working. But in your opinion, how has COVID-19 changed the threat landscape for businesses? What are the key things that companies should be looking at?
Sure. Andy, you go first, actually. Yeah.
I think there's been much greater attention, obviously, by the corporate technology folks about the fact that they have many more of their employees and contractors working remotely, whether it's home or anywhere else. And so the need to try to push out the same kinds of risk management practices in all the devices that the employees and contractors use is very, very important. And of course, the needs of the more technical requirements in terms of what capabilities an employee, say, needs if they're going to be allowed to work at home or have a hybrid work experience, but also the practices of how you're going to protect the data, what data you're going to be exposed to the internet, basically, and the importance of encryption. So there's been a much greater recognition that the kinds of practices that have increasingly been used within the corporate and academic sphere need to be applied really across the board. And that's where we get into some of the principles such as zero trust we'll talk about later.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we do want to get in. I do want to come back to zero trust, but what are your thoughts?
You know, I'll talk about it at a bit more of a technical standpoint. In our 2021 stats reports, we noted, which looks back at the previous 12 months in terms of the landscape from a cybersecurity standpoint, we saw a 40% increase in exposed remote access services. And exposed remote access services are increasing your attack surface, and if they're not sort of secured properly, you get remote. You know, you get people trying to breach, and you get ransomware problems and stuff. So So the COVID-19, the new normal, which I didn't believe in, but I sort of believe in it now in terms of, I don't think people are going to go back to work like they did. I think there's a lot of capital efficiency for organizations in order maybe to have smaller bricks and mortar offices. And I think people have proven, and industries have proven, that they can work remotely at home as effectively, if not more effectively in some cases. But it does change the attack surface and the landscape. As I said, the idea of overnight giving 10,000 to 100,000 people remote access so they can work, that did lead to a massive change in terms of what sort of a threat actor could do. But then there's other challenges as well. I'd love to hear what Andy's thoughts are. Things like collaboration in development. So software development is always about innovation. And it's also about trying to do things in maybe a future-proof way and do them in a secure way. And I find it's hard to innovate if individual contributors are remote. They're all remote, so you can't discuss how to do something at the coffee machine or some things as simple as that. So remote working may result in slightly weaker or less secure software because of the human interaction around developing and building things is sort of, people are remote, right? So I think that could be an issue as well. I've yet to see it, but yeah.
What do you think about that, Andy? I mean, obviously, Huawei is a very large company and an innovative one at that. I mean, how do you see this new normal, and how does collaboration work, I suppose, in an office environment when people aren't in the same place?
Well, collaboration runs across the board in terms of working for example, a particular customer, a particular industry or sub-industry in a particular country. And so I kind of look at collaboration in terms of, okay, well, how does the public and private sector need to collaborate to help enable these newer technologies, the capabilities of 5G and what 5G in turn will enable? So how the country is going to figure out what kind of regulatory framework are we going to have? What are we going to do in terms of spectrum? What are we going to do in terms of shared space for things like the base stations? And what are we going to charge for spectrum? Because if you charge too much money, then the companies don't have the ability to roll it out. But of course, the other aspect of it is the need for collaboration in terms of security. Addressing risk is what we're really talking about. So within the company, making sure the key people in the business groups, and we do this on a global level as well as regional and within individual countries within Huawei, to make sure there's a clear understanding of what are the business objectives we're talking about, what's the threat landscape, what are the kinds of controls that need to be in place, and how do you set up systems within the company to make sure there's internal compliance, to make sure there's what's been referred to as a separation of duties. So the individual or individuals that are responsible to do something are different than the ones who are going to double check whether it's going to be done. And collaboration with our customers, we see an evolving threat landscape, and perhaps that's implicit in your question. So the rollout of 5G is going to take a number of years. And I understand that there are at least 20 vendors have launched over 70 industrial 5G modules, and more than 140 industry device modules are now available. I mean, even just Huawei alone, we have over 3,000 innovation projects worldwide, kind of a bringing 5G to business kind of a thing. So that fundamental collaboration within a country and globally about, okay, what are the security requirements? You see what's happening, the consideration after the HSE ransomware attack in Ireland. You see it in terms of the major attacks that particularly plagued the US with SolarWinds and Microsoft Exchange Server. So the need to work together to establish requirements, the ability to monitor whether or not there's compliance. This is within countries and globally, because we start to see now that when you talk about the higher level attacks, the nation state, sophisticated attacks, you need to really have a comprehensive approach, because the nation states can hack into everybody. And so that raises a lot of important concerns regarding collaboration and trying to find ways to have greater accountability.
You mentioned the HSE attack there. I think we're all become a bit like amateur experts on ransomware and what it means. I think for a lot of people, it may have been surprising just how long it took the HSE to get certain systems up and running again because of the level of the attack. And also the cleanup job that happens after something like this. Because I think a lot of the time we focus on the actual ransomware attack, but then once the headlines go, that's it. You know, we forget that there is weeks and weeks and weeks of work for even just the average company putting their systems back together. I mean, can we talk a bit more about that? I mean, what is the impact of these attacks on companies? We're talking reputational damage as well, but just from a practical perspective, what are you, if you are subject to a ransomware attack, I mean, what are you looking at really?
Yeah. Okay. Ransomware attacks are interesting and they've evolved, and there's many reasons for that. We can talk forever about it, but a lot of ransomware also exfiltrates data. So it steals the data and encrypts the data. And what that means is you're subject to maybe a number of problems. And at that point, you'd be blackmailed for a release of data, which is what happened in the HSE. And you then want to, they're trying to encourage you to pay for a key to decrypt your data. So that can be catastrophic for any business. The impacts are anything from, obviously loss of the entire business, which, the HSE, I think shown they really struggled. They've done a great job, but they really struggled to recover. That they had to draft in people from all across the bandwidth or the spectrum of society to help recover. The idea, around being breached as well. So getting ransomware and getting your data being encrypted is one problem. But if there's a data breach or an exfiltration of personal identifiable information, you may be subject to GDPR penalties. You have to involve the Data Protection Commissioner. GDPR fines can be very, very heavy. And in effect, so it's double the damage. So what you wind up with then is a recovery cost to get your business back, hopefully without paying the actual cyber criminals. And then on top of that, then you may be under legislative fines, from things like GDPR or some other local like CCPA in California, whatever. And on top of that, then the idea would be is, individuals whose personal identified information was stolen probably in some cases may have the right to bring it to court and sue you as well. Mm-hmm. So it's the impact of that type of thing is huge. I think the HSE have done a great job. But some of the underlying factors of that, like the Conti group, which perpetrated the act. We're talking about industrialized cybercrime. And probably that's the difference where, there's things about, there's an uptick in this type of activity. There's more of it happening. Colonial Pipeline in the Eastern Seaboard, the HSE, etc. And the problem is that, the likes of Bitcoin, for example, has increased in value dramatically. Therefore, the funding these organizations have, these criminal organizations has increased dramatically, with the increase in value in Bitcoin. They're heavily funded. These people can hire. They have incentive programs. They're pretty much like a legitimate business, but they're not, obviously. But that's what we're faced with. It's not kids play anymore. It's pretty serious.
That's the thing, actually, because a few years ago, there was a spate of ransomware attacks, but it was all very small stuff. I know I spoke to a couple of businesses myself who had been hit by them. And actually, one thing that one of the victims said was, once she had paid the Bitcoin ransom that they asked for, and it would have been small in comparison to the HSE ransom demand, would have been a couple of €1,000. But she said it was the best customer service she'd ever had. She couldn't fault them. Like I said, it sounded weird to say that, but it was such a stressful experience. She said once she paid that money, she said they were falling over themselves to give her the decryption key and to help her get out of that particular mess. But Andy, I suppose from a global perspective, I mean, this is an increasing problem. I mean, you mentioned a couple of the high profile attacks, and like we're talking about pipelines and health services. We're not talking about small to medium enterprises here, even though they are at risk as well. So I mean, what are you seeing on a global scale? What is the key takeaways that you would have from this?
Well, just as cyber attacks have increased a lot in Ireland and many other countries of the world, the prevalence and publicity around the ransomware attacks have really helped to get the attention of decision makers and politicians and the public to try to suggest that something needs to be done. Of course, this is a complicated area, whether you're working within Ireland or whether you're looking at the global perspective. The concept of best practices and what is necessary and what's recommended, whether you're an individual consumer user or whether you're a company of many sizes or a major large company. There are particular things of best practices that should be done. It's different than what we may think about in our ordinary life, in our everyday life, where there's not a question of, okay, now we're secure. It's really, as is often said, security is a journey, not a destination. And so, but we have to have organizations who have to understand these are the best practices. This is how you have to prioritize as part of a risk management approach, because you can't eliminate all risk. So these are some of the things that need to be done. And those who lead organizations, whether government or the private sector, they need to be held accountable to make sure that their organization, consistent with their business objectives and risk environment, are doing what they should be doing to address risk. That doesn't mean bad things are going to happen, but there's some techniques in doing that that can help minimize the risk and allow a maintenance of some resilience that despite the fact that you may be harmed, you can keep up and running. So for example, you have to maintain offline encrypted backups of your data, and you have to regularly test those backups. You need to have plans for how you're going to respond to incidents. You have to mitigate the internet-facing vulnerabilities. There's certain configurations of your systems and products that need to be in place. But the leaders of organizations don't need to be experts, but they need to, if they don't have experts within their own companies. And even if they do, they need to have independent folks who say, okay, these are the best practices. What are you doing? What aren't you doing? What is a time frame and a plan to get from where you are in terms of your risk posture to a better risk posture? I think the idea of accountability is one that has been sorely missing around the world. And we often, one of our U.S. senators, a few weeks ago, in one of our Sunday morning news programs, he said, well, these recent attacks have been a wake-up call. He said, but we often fall back to sleep. Well, that is absolutely right. There needs to be internal accountability, particularly for publicly traded companies, for public organizations, that somebody's going to be checking to make sure they're doing what they're supposed to be doing. So you have an idea who is in a vulnerable position before the bad things happen. And you need to hold them accountable, not just after the bad things happen, but you need to hold them accountable to do what they should be doing. And whoever is supposed to provide the funding, to make sure they're providing the funding that's necessary, or they own the risk. There's got to be a lot more attention to that. Plus, we need to find out ways to have greater clarity of responsibilities globally and greater accountability for governments and private companies globally. And we can talk about that.
Sure.
I do think, there's an awful lot of concentration on what big companies are doing. Obviously, they're the ones that make the headlines. But from a smaller company point of view, I assume that advice is across the board, that this is what every company should be doing, whether you are, employing 10,000 people, 100,000 people, or 10 people or less. I mean, surely that, the advice is fairly standard. But what can small and medium enterprises who probably don't have a massive budget for cybersecurity defense, I mean, what are kind of the easy wins that they can score?
Sure. I'll go first on this one. So there's fundamentals, and fundamentals sometimes don't cost a lot of money. The idea of going out and spending €50,000 on a threat intelligence system to do whatever with shiny lights, on a shiny box that you put on your network, you really don't need. There's a lot of fundamentals that can be done cheaply. Frequent backups. Andy mentioned offline backups. The idea of backing up frequently, and frequency is really important, because if I mentioned an interview in the Irish Times publication yesterday. If the frequency if it's frequent enough, it means if you do get breached or ransomware, you're only going to lose a piece, an amount of data relative to the frequency of your backups, right? So it means if you're not backing up, you're backing up every 6 months, you're going to lose 6 months data. If you're backing up every 12 hours or every night, you lose the previous day's data or whatever, right? So that is not expensive. There are solutions out there to do that. The other thing around attacks like ransomware attacks, I know we're always talking about, but any type of hacking or breach attempt, a lot of that starts with a hack. It starts with finding a vulnerability. A lot of the cyber criminal actors, a lot of the toolkits you can buy for a couple of $100s on the dark net. You don't even have to be an expert anymore to commit these acts. You can buy a toolkit which does it all for you, for a couple of $100 on the dark web. What you in effect need to do is look at the fact that you need to fix vulnerabilities, you need to patch, you need to be aware. So there's two things there. One is visibility. What systems do I have that are exposed? And also then, am I at least fixing the critical issues? Nobody can fix all the issues, but let's try and fix the critical risk issues, the high risk issues. These guys, these cyber criminals are using, like the Conti group, which is the HSC, their most common avenue of attack was using vulnerabilities from 2018 and 2020. They're not 0 days, they're known vulnerabilities. We know they exist. There is a patch for them, but there's lots of people that aren't patching. There's lots of people that aren't protecting enough because they're either not aware or they have some other struggle. So fundamentals like backing up, like getting some sort of visibility on your systems. What have I got live? What have I got exposed? We also need to do it internally, because if there is a breach, Andy talked about resilience. If there is a breach, think of it this way: if our armor is breached, hopefully we have some chainmail below that, right? So we've a certain level of resilience, and we need to possibly look at what systems are critical on our internal network, if there's such a thing anymore. And we need to make sure that we have the right controls against them. Things like encryption. A lot of systems now have built-in encryption. All you need to do is enable it, right? People aren't doing it because they don't know the risks. So I think just to cap it off, like there are lots of things people can do to up their game. And what's important to note is these threat actors look for soft underbellies to attack. There's two things they look for. One is the ability to pay. So is this business a good business to attack? And two, do they have vulnerabilities? And if they find a business which has weaknesses that are exploitable easily, and they potentially have a couple of 100,000 or a couple of million quid to pay the ransom, they're the businesses that in effect are going to be attacked first. Because we're hunting here. We're hunting for bears. We're going to shoot the slowest bears, the ones that we can shoot easily. So that's sort of the way it works.
I think that's excellent advice. And I think we're talking about the kind of counterparts between consumer activity and consumer good cyber hygiene and organizations, private as well as government. And so the idea of implementing the best practices across the board, and it requires the kinds of things Ian talked about in terms of updating all your software, making sure your configurations are correct. As a consumer, the antivirus, anti-malware tools for a large organization, and I know Ian's company has a counterpart. The organizations conduct regular vulnerability scanning, but individuals and organizations need great spam filters, because phishing attacks, people have to stop clicking on links in emails, and we have to stop sending emails that don't give any indication that this is something new. We just see something, we click on it, looking for something that's funny or particularly interesting, and we take a gigantic chance with that. I think another area that I think is not focused on enough, I think the internet service providers have visibility into what a lot of the customers are doing. And they can see that individual customers, their systems may have been hijacked by malicious actors who are running malicious activity through that vulnerable organization.
Yep.
And they can route attacks, they can route spam, they can route malware through those. And the ISPs can see those. And they can see that there's these networks of these combined, they call these hijacked computers bots or robots. There's these botnets, these networks of these hijacked computers that can launch massive attacks. And so I think the internet service providers, there's a lot more visibility. There's a lot more things that they can do to try to reduce the risk.
It's an excellent point, actually.
I think as well that there is an intersection there between the consumer kind of security thing and the business security thing, because as you can see, I am not in the office at the moment. I am at home. I'm working on my home computer. I'm working off a home internet connection. I mean, what can businesses do there? Because I mean, obviously we can all, in the office you have the the control over all those systems, to keep all those systems up to date, to make sure that everything is patched. I'm going to admit now, just before we went live on this, I got a notification that there was an update waiting on my computer. Now, obviously, I wasn't in a position right there and then to hit install now, because that's, blue screen of boredom for about 15 minutes, and you'd all still be waiting for me, and that wasn't about to happen. But we do have a tendency to kind of put things off. Consumers in particular, I suppose, or just when you're at home, it's not as important. We don't see it as important as when we're in the office. An update is automatically pushed out. How do we, I suppose, get over that hurdle? Either of you could answer this one for me, but how do businesses get over that hurdle if they have this kind of bring your own device culture in the company now?
There are certainly mechanisms and privileges that can be enforced from anywhere in the world. And so the company should be working with their employees and their contractors to make sure that they have the right technologies available on their computers in terms of encryption of the work emails, the work documents. Those kinds of things should be protected and should be pretty darn secure everywhere.
Yeah, like here, the idea of forced, remote workers. What do we need? We need to send data in a secure way. We need to build laptops in such a way which maybe the marketing department don't have administrative rights, right? That means if they do get infected, the infection isn't as severe because the infection is running on the rights of the user, and maybe doesn't have rights to certain parts of the laptop. We need to look at things like VPNs, as I mentioned, of the increase on exposed RDP or exposed remote desktop solutions in the last year, 12 months to 2021. I think there's a little bit of the problem there was that there was a rush for people to continue, the business to continue to work. People weren't going to the offices. Ireland has one of the most, I suppose, severe lockdowns for the right reasons, but it has had a very strong lockdown where people were encouraged to work at home. And you had IT departments struggling to provision people with some sort of remote access solution. Some companies have been doing it for years, and it was easy enough to do, relatively speaking. But a lot of companies overnight had to provision thousands of employees, salespeople, administration people, IT people. It's not just techies; it's people from all walks of life in the business, and provision them with remote working. And in some cases, they didn't get it 100% right. So, but there are, as Andy said, there are solutions built into most modern operating systems and remote teleworking solutions, which can enforce a lot of the basic controls, but unfortunately, sometimes it's not done because it's an oversight due to the rush of people trying to get remote enabled in the first place.
So some of these problems that we as consumers and we in the work environment trying to deal with the world the way it is, but also trying to at a more macro level trying to change it. So you see. Some of the work of the Cybersecurity Agency in Ireland, the work of the United States government, trying to focus on some fundamental issues like software security and the processes for developing software, the processes for analyzing software is very much of an evolving kind of thing. Because if we can reduce those kind of known vulnerabilities that Ian talked about, and we can accelerate the ability to fix them. For example, President Biden's executive order on cybersecurity talked about the concept of an SBOM, a software bill of materials, that is machine readable information that a company can receive from a supplier where they can know what software they have. And so when there's an announcement of sharing that there's a vulnerability out there, talked about 0 days, then they can quickly find out whether it's in their systems and they can fix it. So you saw some of the victims of SolarWinds, those who had software bill of materials were able to fix what they were doing much more quickly. One of the other big issues that the US and other countries are focused on is the whole issue of supply chain risk. So the importance not just of protecting ourselves, but recognizing that cybersecurity is a shared responsibility. So you take in the case of telecommunications, we're a telecom equipment supplier to organizations around the world. And so the focus of saying, okay, a company needs to do a risk analysis of their suppliers. These are larger companies, of course. A risk analysis of their own supply chain. And where they find weaknesses where they don't have the adequate information. They need to put in place additional risk mitigation so that the problem is not going to, carry on. And so trying to come up with hopefully global requirements for software assurance, global requirements for how to address supply chain risk, because we have a global IT supply chain, despite some efforts to the contrary. And so working together, we need to come up with those kinds of requirements. And there need to be some international agreements. One way to call them might be mutual trust agreements that governments and companies sign, committing to follow good practices and having some kind of accountability if they don't. It's not going to be an instant thing or something tomorrow, but if we don't start moving down a path toward having strong internationally developed requirements, standards where possible, industry best practices, and have the ability, transparency. So a customer needs to have some visibility, at least let's say the telecom space. The operators need some visibility into the telecom equipment suppliers. They need to know whether we and our competitors are doing the right thing. And when incidents happen, they have to have visibility. That special relationship between companies and partners is something where information can be shared. You can't share with governments, but you can share with others. And so the idea of saying, as Germany has done, saying, look, the operators are responsible to address the risk from the telecom equipment suppliers and all other suppliers. The SolarWinds and Microsoft Exchange server attacks were examples where trusted suppliers were violated. And so they've got responsibility to make sure their supply chain is addressing the risk appropriately, and then specific requirements on the suppliers. You need to do these 11 things. That kind of effort to have requirements on greater transparency and visibility and greater accountability, whether it's by contract or government regulation, those are the kinds of things that can help us manage risk more effectively. And as we move into the 5G enabled world, the true standalone 5G, these technologies are going to be much more important, and we're going to be at much greater risk than we are now if we don't address them in a comprehensive, collaborative way.
I think that there's something that comes up quite a bit, though, isn't it? Collaboration. I mean, because there is a bit of a culture of silence around cyber attacks. I mean, there's been some fairly big ransomware attacks in Ireland that most people actually wouldn't be aware of because it doesn't affect them personally. And there is a kind of a tendency, I think, if you are the victim of a ransomware attack or any kind of a cyber attack, you say as much as you have to by law, I suppose, and then that's it. But like, if we had a much more open discussion about this, if companies were a bit more open about the risks and the challenges that they've faced, maybe other people could learn from their experiences. Maybe we wouldn't be in quite a dire situation at times. What do you think about that?
I think it's really, really good. And to be honest, I've been involved in a micro level in the state in Ireland to try and move the dial. There's an organization called Cyber Ireland. There's the OWASP chapters, open source, and there needs to be, in my opinion, there needs to be more collaboration with the private sector and more collaboration with the private sector and government. The government needs to understand that the private sector probably is faced with this type of thing on a daily basis, particularly, say, if you have a penetration testing company or an software architecture company or a vulnerability management company. They do this day in, day out. They're experts in their field, and there's a lot of wealth there. These private organizations shouldn't be treated just as vendors by government organizations, but more as partners. There needs to be a lot more knowledge share. There needs to be the ability for maybe to set up frameworks, and I'm talking in the Irish context, but it may apply to other states as well. There needs to be knowledge share. There needs to be frameworks built between private and public. And it's not about commercial interests. It's about state interests. It's about, about Ireland incorporated or about Ireland as a sovereign state. And I think there's a lot to do there. There's a lot more to do there. We definitely have the talent in the country. We definitely have some very, very skilled and talented people that work for multinationals and local companies. But when you talk to those people, a lot of them aren't getting the chance to be involved. They're not getting the chance to contribute or to help steer the direction of Ireland as a sovereign state. And what are we doing for cybersecurity? And the HSE, there was a lot of chatter between various non-profit organizations in Ireland and also private organizations in Ireland, various groups around how can we help fix this. But the unfortunately, in my opinion, it seems to be it's the usual thing. An event occurs, you bring in the highly paid consultants, they fix the problem, and then we go on as business as usual, as opposed to taking a step back, trying to build a sustainable framework, a list of common controls. The UK has a thing called Cyber Essentials. We should have a Cyber Essentials in Ireland, right? Which is if you can get a badge associated to your business to say, in effect, that you meet a minimum criteria from a cybersecurity standpoint. And also, when the government is tendering for companies to deliver the government services, it should be a requirement that these companies also have a minimum level of security, which means that, you talk about software supply chain, you talk about, the software food chain. If the supplier is vulnerable, the government could get infected or get attacked because of the chain of data, the chain of services. And we need to do a lot better as a country.
I think that's right. And you obviously have quite a workforce in Ireland, and with some of the major technology firms, yep, with their data centers and offices in Ireland, there's a tremendous motivation to try to continue to improve the cybersecurity landscape. Your point about procurement, yes, the idea of risk-informed procurement requirements are absolutely essential. And those can be private relationships, but contractual requirements for what needs to be done and what needs to be done on a continuing basis, and when it's involving government contracts, such as some of the work coming out of President Biden's executive order, requirements for government contractors is fundamentally important. You mentioned open source. Open source is something that is very, very important. You may have seen the major Google statement that just came out about their huge commitment to cybersecurity, and they talk about open source. And they pointed out open source in theory is a great idea, but if nobody is actually looking at the open source to make sure that the situation is addressed, that's a problem. Huawei, you may not know, is very active in open source. That's going to become much more obvious as we move forward. But the operating system that we have really developed for connecting all kinds of devices, our Harmony OS, is based on the Open Harmony operating system. Just like Android has an open Android under it, and then Google has the proprietary piece on top, which helps developers, and it also helps risk management, where you have this common basis of open code that can be revised pursuant to the direction from the community. You can get continuous improvement, and you can help create a basis where you can have innovation, and we can continue to grow the path into the fourth industrial revolution. So
and transparency.
Yeah. I think that might be a good place to end the discussion now, because unfortunately we are just out of time. Thank you so much to both my guests, both Andy and Owen. Thank you to Huawei and EdgeScan for supporting this session. And thank you to the audience for tuning in. I'm reliably informed that this is going to be available as a video to watch back. So if there's anything that you missed, you can always go back and take a look at it at a later date.
Thank you.
Thanks. Take care.